Gladys, would you tell us what the story is behind this lovely book? You've captured Gerry's face very beautifully in this front Unity Pilgrim. But how did this book of how many pages? 250 nearly?
Yeah. Roughly,
how did this book come about? What's the story there?
One day I was in my house with my baby who's only a few months old, and this email came in from Ken. Basically said something along the lines, how would you like to write Gerry Reynolds' biography? And I was sort of like, that sounds interesting, but I'm on maternity leave and I have a 2-month-old son here. But I was really intrigued by the opportunity. I had been working for nearly 10 years at the Irish School of Ecumenics, so I knew Gerry and I knew a bit about his work and so forth, and I thought his was a story that really deserved to be told. So I emailed Ken back and I said, sure, tell me more, and so forth. And I got a feeling from Ken that I suppose Gerry was in some ways reluctant about the project. He sort of had these excuses like, I'm too old, it's not that significant in my life, why should I do it or whatnot. But Ken at the time had been working on his own memoirs, and like myself, he knew something of Gerry's life and knew that it would be, I think, of historical interest, but also of interest in terms of say people's Christian lives or whatever, to see, I suppose, the inner workings of someone who had really, and I don't use this word lightly, his life was very saintly, and it was a witness really to an inspiring Christian faith. So Ken and Gerry turned up at my doorstep one day then to chat with me about it, and I sat there basically feeding my son while we convinced Gerry that this would be a good idea.
I had a lot of persuading of Father Gerry to get him up to Gladys's house, because Father Gerry, when I said, Gerry, my memoirs are coming out, I spent 4 years in a cave writing my memoirs, but I said, you need to tell your story. And he kept saying to me, because his health was already in decline, he kept saying to me things like, Ken, I'm far too old, I don't have the mental energy, I don't know where everything is that I would want to record, and I don't think I could complete the task. I'm just not up for it. So I went away and I thought, and I said, well, I'm not giving up with Father Gerry, because he didn't give up on me. And I thought I would love someone who would write it sensitively and go really inside his soul and heart and mind and explore the world of Gerry Reynolds that I knew from personal friendship for so long. And so I came back to him and said, Gerry, if I get a scholar, a woman, a writer, and somebody who knows you to undertake the task of writing, would you open all those cupboards that you have your notes and diaries in, and would you give them access to everything else that you have written, and also perhaps the archives of Clonard? And he went away and thought about it, and he came back and he said, okay, if you get somebody to do the hard work, I'll do the rest. And that was what got Father Gerry into my car and up to meet Gladys. Gladys, here's my question to you. When you stepped inside the world of Father Gerry through his diaries and his writings, what were the two big discoveries you made?
Well, I suppose there were some things that were surprising. Is this maybe what you're what you're alluding to? One of the discoveries, I suppose, in the diaries that I wasn't aware of, and I don't think a lot of people were aware of, was his, I suppose, lifelong celibate relationship of love with a religious sister, which to me was really fascinating. People know about Gerry's efforts in the peace process and also some of his ecumenical work, but that aspect of his personal life was fascinating, and kind of, I suppose, I struggle, maybe the right word here, the struggle to kind of remain faithful to that friendship throughout his life. In the book, I call her his Anam Cara, the Irish, as I struggle with my Irish, it's not even a hard one. The Anam Cara, who was a real, I suppose, support and inspiration and a help to him throughout his life. So, that would have been a real discovery, I suppose. And the other thing that stuck out for me from the diaries was really, I suppose, just kind of the person Gerry was. So he would write sort of prayers in his diaries or notes. Say he'd been on a train, he would talk to the person beside him on the train, he'd find out something about them. He would, pray specifically for them. Just that sort of very human approach, to a stranger he might have met on the street, then suddenly became someone who was really, I suppose, a beloved child of God that he then, prayed for and took unto himself to extend that, I suppose, that real personal warmth he had to them. So those kind of personal qualities stood out for me, apart from that kind of public work and behind the scenes work that's of historical significance.
Gladys, could you explain a little bit about Father Gerry came to Clonard in 1983, but behind that was a process of discernment within the Redemptorist Order. And I know that some folk here were involved in shaping that process. But why was Father Gerry brought up from the south to Belfast to pioneer this work in Clonard? What were the qualities in him? And what was perhaps the vision behind his being placed here in the middle of the Troubles, in the middle of a conflict? What were the expectations and hopes of those who decided, as it were, in a chessboard, to move him into a very, very attacking, crucial position?
I think there were a lot of factors that came into play, and to answer that question, I'm going to take you back a little bit into Gerry's family history, I think. So Gerry grew up in Limerick, and his father died when he was 6, but he had 2 uncles who were members of the Redemptorist congregation, and both of those uncles had been at various times stationed in Belfast, and one uncle, Uncle Gerard, had been in Clonard for many years and was a rector in Clonard, and was a pioneer of what was at that time called Clonard's Mission to Non-Catholics. So this is like in the 1940s, and if I got the dates wrong, Brendan will set me right. So it's 1940s, so this is pre-Vatican II, pre-ecumenism and so forth. But basically, Clonard's mission to non-Catholics was inviting, Protestants into a Catholic church in a non-threatening, non-proselytizing way to ask questions about Catholicism. What's this about? Which, in those years was really something quite radical to do, So in Gerry's family history, there was sort of this proto-ecumenical uncle who was a pioneer in this field. And, there's plenty of evidence throughout Gerry's early life of the influence of that uncle and his other uncle who was also a Redemptorist, his aunt who was a Mercy sister, and sort of the openness and the sympathies they had. So there's that aspect of Gerry's family background I think is important. As a young Redemptorist, Gerry also had become involved with something called the Jesus Caritas Fraternity, which is a priest fraternity. It's an international organization. And he was one of the founders, the pioneers in Ireland of setting up the fraternity. And one of the emphases of the fraternity, particularly after Vatican II, was ecumenism and interfaith dialogue. So he had that sort of aspect and interest before he ever came north. Now, in the early 1980s, late 1970s, Gerry served as rector in Limerick, and then he was in Esker and Athenry, County Galway during those years. But in his diaries, I see little hints of kind of a desire to come to Belfast. The Adoration Sisters had set up a convent in 1981, and he was friends with some of them. He would come visit them. And of course, Redemptorists are noticing with their brother Redemptorists coming to stay in Clonard and visit the Adoration convent as well. So they're catching on to Gerry's interest in ecumenism and in Belfast. And when Pope John Paul II came to Ireland, one of the things Gerry wrote in his diary was he felt that this was a personal call on him for a peace mission, but he had to wait because he hadn't been assigned to Clonard and so forth. And he would ask his friends in the Jesus Caritas fraternity, should I ask to go to Clonard? And they were sort of like, no, just wait and let's see what God says about that. And then eventually that decision was made.
When he came to Clonard, one of the things Gerry always said to me, because I was, as a Presbyterian with a very strong emphasis upon predestination, we all have this basic view that God plans his world and his universe. And Gerry was almost the opposite of the planning kind of faith inside him. His big thing to me, when he saw me tense and wanting to tie everything down and to work out plans, he'd always say, Ken, just relax a bit, let it all unfold, was his big word to me. So I would take a big deep breath and leave it. We were very different in many ways. But when Gerry did come to Belfast, he showed a really interesting connection between faith, Redemptorist. The word Redemptorist is very much like the shops you now find, for example, all over, that takes in furniture that is fairly beaten up or being abandoned, And they have these lovely words: repair, refresh, reseal, reclaim. And the word redemptorist is very much in that, you know, we can take something that isn't working and we can turn it into something beautiful. And what struck me about Gerry's approach was there were always cultural and political implications coming out of his faith, very much like a waterfall flowing over the top. That there is some, I remember, for example, when Archbishop Desmond Tutu came to Fitzroy to speak, one of the things he addressed was, people used to say in South Africa when he was attacking apartheid, why don't you just stick to the religious side? Why don't you stay out of politics? And why don't you just pray, you know, and read the Bible? And he said, well, 80% of the Bible is politics, because it's the way you shape the country for yourself and also for those who are coming after you. And one of the first mentors of Father Gerry when he came to Belfast was Father Alec Reid, who knew very, very clearly the close connection between prizing people open and prizing open political situations so that a new future could develop. There's certain parts of the Gulf and also of Japan where these pearl divers, and these young kids take a huge deep breath, go down about 30 meters, and they harvest the oysters, and then they bring them up, and then eventually they bring them all back, and somebody prizes them open, and then in go the tweezers and takes out the pearl. In other words, in the most closed situation where we are being prized open, and I think that is part of the Redemptorist vocation, is the prizing open to get something really valuable out of what is a despairing situation. And Father Gerry Reynolds was to some extent already open, but in his conversations with Father Alec Reid, he began to realize that we were a community that needed to be prized open. And that includes culturally, spiritually, it includes emotionally, it includes politically. What was it that Father Alec Reid shared with Gerry? Because Alec was a long time here before Gerry arrived, and Gerry took to Father Alec in terms of not only an advisor, but a real guider in terms of how to go about a ministry in a very dysfunctional community. What was it that Father Gerry learnt from Father Alec Reid?
Yeah, well, one of the first things Gerry did or started doing when he arrived in Belfast was speaking to every Redemptorist in Clonard to try to see where he would fit in. And what he said, and what he wrote in his diary at the time as well, was that the most important conversation he had was with Alec Reid. And sort of the phrase that came out of that conversation was that Alec had said to him, that dialogue makes room for the Holy Spirit to work in human history. So Alec's, his real emphasis on the importance of dialogue, and in this context, that's dialogue with people in the IRA, those people that are in the political wilderness, as it were. Being willing to talk to them was really important. And I think sometimes we forget at that time, this was when nobody talked to people who were in the IRA. This was sort of beyond the pale. And for Alec to be already engaged in that was really, I suppose, a courageous thing, and something that we maybe take it a little bit for granted now. So that really made an impression on Gerry, I suppose. And the other thing I think that was important in Gerry's first year in Clonard, in terms of getting to know the area well, he developed fairly close friendship with the Hartley family. So many of you here probably know the Hartleys and so forth. And Tom Hartley was a good friend, I think, was mentioned in his diaries. But also one of the discoveries I think I could say that was made in the diaries was the role of Frances Hartley, who was Tom's sister. She was a real support to both Alec and Gerry, particularly in those early days of the 1980s, in terms of prayer and really encouragement to both Alec and Gerry to keep going in the work, because it was, it was difficult, it was challenging, and you could go for long periods of time without seeing real progress, I suppose. So,
Gladys, one of the sides of Father Gerry that I knew, because I knew him so well and we talked a lot about it, was his inner self. Gerry was like me in some ways, in that he was what you would call, in terms of varieties of religious experience, they're the people who are the healthy-minded optimists who see the world all bright and cheery and just love the lovely things in the world. And then there's another kind of religious mindset, which is what they call the tortured soul, right? And one of the interesting things about the tortured soul, according to William James, a psychologist of religion, is it is a furnace out of which comes something very creative. I mean, a very good example is Caravaggio and all his art, Tchaikovsky and all his music. Sometimes when you go through a sense of self-questioning and self-examination, what happens is that something comes out of that that is very giftable to someone. It actually makes a difference. And what I noticed about Father Gerry was how often he would journal and write down his thoughts and feelings. He would often share with me his feelings because it did two things. It helped him to understand his inner self, but it also helped him to what I would call self-locate. Because very often inside ourselves we live in a fog. We don't know, should I be doing this? Should I be doing that? Should I be doing the other thing? When you ask yourself big questions, and Gerry's was, what God do you want me to do? I was not sure where to go as someone relatively new to Belfast. There came to him out of those deep self-questioning experiences a sense of self-clarity. He knew exactly, the fog lifted, he knew exactly where the dartboard was. That his life was going to go in this direction rather than where does it go? Because every life has something valuable to give. Now, what I want to ask you is this. How much of the self-questioning aspect of Father Gerry did you uncover in his diaries and in his writings?
Well, I mean, I suppose a lot of his diaries really is a record of that. Now, I've been told that Redemptorists are encouraged to journal in their training, to self-reflect that way. But also his involvement in the Jesus Caritas fraternity, which started in the 1970s and continued to the end of his life. Part of that was they met and had a monthly or a year, every few months, a review of life. So there would be these long passages in his diary where he was doing his review of life. What have I done well? Where have I fallen short? What is my mission? Really reflecting on it. And I suppose this is where, Ken, you're getting this impression of being tortured. And to some degree, I suppose it is torturous. But I think, as you said, it helped him to clarify things. But I think it's important to emphasize he kind of just wasn't doing this alone, just him and God. He was also had that wider circle of people he was sharing with. I think that was important. And allied to that, Gerry's commitment to prayer, I suppose, was really phenomenal. So he had tried throughout his life to set aside an hour a day for adoration in front of the Blessed Sacrament, which when you think about it, how many of us could sit for an hour in a day and sort of, in silent contemplation, I suppose, reflect on your inner self and try to hear what God is saying to you, if we want to use those terms. So, that in itself is also remarkable. And in terms of picking up some of the stuff about optimism and pessimism and being a tortured soul and so forth, I think what came through to me was that these sort of practices of prayer and the supportive friendships he had, that was what was key to keeping Gerry going throughout the decades really of ministry in a difficult context. Without these kind of self-reflective practices to keep himself sane, I don't think he would have been able to do what he did. And towards the end of the book, I have a quote from Gerry did an interview with the Irish Catholic a couple years before he died. And one of the questions Martin O'Brien, the reporter, asked him was, what of your 50 years of ministry, what stands out for you? And his answer that what stood out for him was the absolute goodness of God. So throughout everything, what he saw reflected back, in the people he met and the work that he did was that God's goodness was at work in the world, basically. So I think that's an inherent optimism, as it were, even if there are these sort of periods of struggle.
Gerry, also, you were saying how Gerry would often sit quietly and before the sacrament, and he also would journal his thoughts, which brings clarity. The Eucharist was very, very important for Gerry. It was re-energizing for him. It was calming. It was stretching his mind as far and as wide as the love of God. You know, he was being opened up, right? It was also expanding his, I was going to say expanding his chest, because as a kid I was very skinny, and I used to read these ads of Charles Atlas, who, if you got this extender here, you could have a real muscular body, you know. So I wanted to be like Charles Atlas and have muscles all over the place, Jim, you know. But there's something in a connection with God that expands your heart. And Gerry found that, I think, in encountering Christ in the Eucharist. But he also found it in encountering Christ among Protestants. And this is really, really important, because something very beautiful in that. Encountering Christ, for me, for example, going to Clonard for so long, I eventually had a deep, deep sense of being part of the Clonard family. I encountered Christ not only through the sacraments, but also I encountered Christ through the friendship and love and affection and openness. But what was it, Father Gerry, this expansion of his heart, what was it that Father Gerry found among Protestants that he felt was really important?
Well, I mean, I think fundamentally he found them as brothers and sisters in Christ, if we can put it that simply. You know, he honestly, I don't want to say he didn't see a division, but he didn't see a distinction. You know, he saw them as of a different tradition and of bringing different gifts to the wider church. But he honestly saw the church as already united, I think, if that makes sense to people. So there's a couple examples maybe that I can use to try to illustrate what I mean by this, or what Gerry meant by this. There was one time when he wrote in his diaries, at times he would lament that other priests in Clonard didn't really get the ecumenical ministry, or didn't get this idea of reaching out to Protestants or whatever. And after one meeting, he shared how at that time he was working with Father Gerry Cassidy on ecumenical mission from Clonard, and they were talking about it. And one of the other priests in Clonard said, well, it's all right what the two Gerrys are doing, but I want to minister to our own people. And for Gerry, that had missed the point entirely, because our own people was everybody, you know, Protestant and Catholic together. So, I mean, I really can't emphasize enough how he really didn't see the division, if that makes sense. And some of the other lovely things, I think, that came out of this way of sort of viewing Protestants as fully equal and bringing, I suppose, unique gifts to the church, maybe in some ways, struck me when I started seeing in his diaries that he had begun to pray to John Calvin, or to petition John Calvin as part of his daily prayers to saints and so forth. And as many of you probably know, John Calvin is the founder of Presbyterianism, so not your usual person for a Catholic priest to petition. But some of the prayers to John Calvin would be things like, let us help our Irish Presbyterian brothers and sisters complete their reform. So he's praying for reform in the Presbyterian Church. And then he also said prayers asking the Presbyterians to help Catholics become more involved in the, you know, lay Catholics more involved in the life of the parish and so forth, to take on, I suppose, that one of the gifts Protestantism has of, you know, trying to involve lay people more in the governance of the church and so forth, and saying, you know, this is something we can learn from Presbyterianism. And it wasn't just John Calvin. John Wesley, founder of Methodism, he was petitioned as well. So these are some of the ways I think Gerry thought about Protestants, and really, I suppose, internalized that sense that we were all in this together by praying to some of the founders of Protestantism.
And that interest, John, that Gerry had in John Calvin, a lot of that came from my conversations with him. Just like he introduced to me the founder of the Redemptorists, Alphonsus Liguori. Yeah. And one of the things I loved about Redemptorist spirituality is the way in which you don't bypass them completely, but you stop seeing people who are surrounded with power or wealth or status, and you start noticing the most forgotten, the one everybody else overlooks. And that really did have a very, very big impact upon me. And I fed Gerry a lot of stuff about the fact that he really didn't know a great deal about the Protestant tradition before, and I've had a lifelong affection for John Calvin, for example. And I used to say to him, Gerry, you know, when John Calvin became the minister of St. Peter's in Geneva, it was a Catholic cathedral. One Sunday, they were celebrating Mass. Next Sunday was a Protestant service, same church. Protestants didn't build their own churches. A parish just changed. They got rid of the Duke, who was imposing big taxes. They got rid of the bishop, who was a very expensive luxury. And they said, we'll run this ourselves. Right? I'm sure that's appealing to a lot of people. But what was really interesting about John Calvin was that at the time of John Calvin in Geneva, and this was quite a common practice throughout the Catholic world, in Europe in particular, most Catholics only received the Eucharist once a year. The priest received every Sunday. And Calvin said, no. We have to give the Eucharist to everybody every Sunday. So Gerry was surprised by that, because that's a Catholic practice. The second thing was the John Calvin's desire to transform the city of Geneva. Because one of the first things he introduced was schools for girls. Girls at the time of the Reformation did not get educated. At 14, many of them went into a convent. Some were married off. And they were really, it was a domestic style dominated life for many of them. But education was really a luxury for very, very, very few. And he says, no way. God has given a good mind and heart to all people, and so we will educate them together. The sewage system in Geneva was causing a high infant mortality. Many women were dying in childbirth, and also people's life expectancy was very short, and the plague was rampant. And because John Calvin had in his congregation in Geneva folk who had all their lives been Catholic, and now the Reformation had come and they were coming now to a Reformed service, he said to the local city councillors, the sewage system in this city is an absolute disgrace. If we believe the message of Christ creates healthy attitudes, healthy relationships, healthy outlooks, and a healthy investment in your community, we need a healthy sewage system. Get rid of this. And so he sent them back into the city council to actually transform the city. And there are many, many other things like this. So a lot of the influence for Gerry seeing the gift and the challenge of the Reformed tradition was paralleled with me being introduced by him to redemptive spirituality. But I said at Gerry's funeral, when I spoke at his funeral in Clonard, I mentioned the fact that, and nobody has contradicted me when I said this, he was in more Protestant churches than any Catholic priest in the history of Ireland. And I'm speaking here now hundreds of other churches. Can I ask you, Gladys, what was the effect of that on him, do you think? Why do you think he took it so passionately? What was he trying to achieve as a result of going in among the Protestant tradition as faithfully as he did?
Well, I think to some extent he was really just modeling what he already believed, and that was that we were already one church, we were already Christians together. And I mean, I suppose one of the ways he achieved this, visiting hundreds of Protestant churches, was through the Unity Pilgrims initiative, which some of you may be familiar with. Now there's a partnership with Clonard and Fitzroy Presbyterian Church, who were Ken ministered many years, which again you also know of, but you also probably know of, I can't assume everyone, but the Unity Pilgrims initiative is something really innovative and unique even in a global context, I think. It got started on Remembrance Sunday in 1994, so not long after or 93, Shankill bomb, whatever year that was. And Gerry sort of felt drawn to go and be with people on the Shankill after that tragedy. And he kind of slipped into the back of a Protestant church on a Sunday, on Remembrance Sunday. He wrote in his diary, he didn't even remember which one it was as he was reflecting on it later. And this allowed him, I suppose, to model solidarity in a way, and also to, come along people in their pain, really, so soon after the Shankill bomb and on Remembrance Day, which in Protestant churches is a day when many of the people who were killed during the Troubles are remembered. And gradually out of that, then Gerry sort of asked people who were part of the Cornerstone community, which was an ecumenical community on the Springfield Road interface that he was involved with for many years. He asked people from there to come along with him and visit Protestant churches on a Sunday. And now that ministry grew over years. It's started with people from Cornerstone, and when Cornerstone folded, it sort of has been incorporated into Clonard's reconciliation ministry now. And a group would go out literally every Sunday and visit a Protestant church after they've already had Mass on the Saturday evening or the Sunday morning. So, I mean, it was part of Gerry's life to every Sunday, you know, that he was alive from 1994 until he died, to go and be with the Protestant congregation in worship without trying to proselytize, without trying to change who they were.
We'll just take a few minutes now, if you would like to either make a comment and or ask a question of Gladys or Ken. Yes, yourself.
Gladys, I was very taken in the book by how you got very much the personal story of Gerry Reynolds. And I can put it in my own way, that it begins in those Dublin years when he's involved in communications, very active, with a great collection of friends around him, particularly Peter Lemass on the what do you call it, the RARC team in Dublin. Then out of that he goes into Esker first of all, and then into Limerick, which looks a little bit black. In fact, it feels very black. And then after that comes the Clonard years, when everything is, you know, going again some way. Ken mentioned it when he talked about I forgot the phrase you used, about, you know, this bleak side that is sometimes processed and turned into something good.
Well, I mean, I suppose it's something that he managed throughout his life by, you know, his reliance on prayer, as it were, you know. But I mean, one thing that struck me as I was reading his diaries, and also I don't think I did mention, I interviewed him 7 times before he died. You know, there was a sense, I suppose, sometimes of discouragement and so forth, but, you know, that unshakable faith in the goodness of God, you know, I think that really is what kept him going and so forth. And even I also interviewed a number of Gerry's colleagues, Redemptorists, and then friends from Protestant traditions as well. And one of the Redemptorists I spoke to said that Gerry was good, what we would call in these days, he was good at self-care. You know, if he needed to take himself away and go for a walk on a lagan with one of his friends, he would kind of do that. And there was maybe a darker side to that for other Redemptorists, in that someone had to cover his duties while he was off taking a walk or so forth. But this was actually a really important part of managing some of the bleaker and the harder times. And you alluded there slightly to his time in Limerick. He was rector in Limerick for 3 or 4 years. And he considered this an absolute failure, and his Redemptorist colleagues in Limerick also considered this an absolute failure, because usually you get 2 terms as rector and they didn't vote for him. And so he kept coming back to this over the course of his life. You know, even like in 2014, he's thinking about this. Why did I fail in Limerick? You know, so there's a sense of that torturing himself in that way. But some of the lessons he learned from that was, I didn't listen adequately to the people around me was one thing. And, you know, also this was a time when he was heavily involved with the Jesus Caritas fraternity. He'd just been involved in establishing it, and he was devoting a lot of time to the priests in that fraternity. And he said, well, I neglected the Redemptorists while I was doing too much in the fraternity and so forth. So, you know, all these sort of aspects come out as well. And I mean, it makes for a very human and realistic person. I think someone who struggles, like we all do, to kind of make it through life and to stay positive, or to stay focused on that absolute goodness of God, as Gerry would have put it. Yeah.
Was he able, you think, to get himself back into what the other members of the Limerick community were doing at that time?
Of the Limerick community?
Yeah, because there's bleak areas, particularly around Limerick. And he doesn't seem to have been able to identify, because one of the main activities of Limerick at that time was the preaching of parish missions.
Yes, yeah.
And I don't think Gerry got much into that.
No, he didn't. Gerry didn't do a lot of preaching through his career at all. And when he was in Limerick, it was also the time when the novena was becoming a big thing as well, you know. And yeah, so he didn't preach a lot on missions. And then when he came to Clonard in latter years, he was actually banned from preaching because 1, people felt he went on too long, and 2, people thought he talked about ecumenism too much and made every sermon about ecumenism, right? So As again, a Redemptorist colleague said to me when I was interviewing him, that Gerry could make any reading in any passage from the Bible come back to the need for ecumenism, when it, that's not really what the liturgy is about every Sunday. So.
Okay. Any other observations or comments or questions you'd like at this stage? We'll have some time at 2 when we wrap up for general points as well. Is that okay?
Actually, I want to come back to a couple things Ken mentioned that I didn't maybe talk about as fully as I could at the time. Just a couple themes that have kind of reoccurred. And one is about women. So Ken, you mentioned John Calvin and getting the girls educated and so forth. And, I've mentioned Frances Hartley and Gerry's Anam Cara, the religious sister. But another thing that came through for me was how important Gerry thought women were in the life of the church. So this was a big deal for him. And there was a period in, the 1980s that he wrote a column for the Irish News, a bi-weekly column called Communion. And he wrote it under a pen name and so forth. But one of the themes he kept coming back to in that column was how important it was for women to be involved in the life of the church. And, more public roles in ministry and so forth. And he absolutely, I have no doubt, he accepted his female Protestant minister colleagues who are ordained as, fully equal clergy in Gerry's mind, so that was important for him. And also the Eucharist, kind of mentioned that. I didn't talk a lot about that when I was talking about how Gerry viewed Protestants, but this is another key theme that is in the book. I mean, Gerry wrote so much in his diary about the Eucharist and how he thought we should be able to share it together, that it becomes a big theme in the book. And that is one of the things that Gerry tortured himself about, because as you know, Catholic canon law prohibits sharing of the Eucharist. And Gerry's involved with Cornerstone Community, he's involved with Conrad Fitzroy, and there will be lots of intimate small group discussions with these groups and times of worship and prayer that would naturally, people would want to end with a Eucharist, and you're not allowed to, right? So there were times, Gerry records in his diaries, well, on this occasion we abstained from Eucharist and it was horrible, and we all felt terrible. And then on another occasion he would say, well, we actually shared Eucharist and so forth. So there is evidence at times Gerry chose to share Eucharist and invited Protestants to share Eucharist as well. And he went to great lengths to justify, himself in this. There were times where, on 2 occasions, he wrote that he thought the Pope would agree with him if he knew the background and the context and the reasoning. So, if you think the Pope is on your side, you can do it with a clear conscience, I suppose. But I'm not making light of this because, as Ken said, Eucharist was absolutely sacred for Gerry. It was, he thought it was really one of the most important parts of the exercise of the Christian faith. So he was not kind of willy-nilly sharing Eucharist lightly. He thought deep within his conscience when this happened that this was really the right thing to do. And towards the end of his life, 2010, one of the initiatives he was involved with setting up was called In Joyful Hope. And this is something that's still going on as well. And basically, Christians of all traditions visit each other's churches to observe the practice of Eucharist or communion. They don't break canon law in this initiative, as it were, to put it in those rather negative terms, I suppose, breaking canon law. They just merely observe. But Gerry saw this as kind of a stepping stone on the way. If we're ever going to get to shared Eucharist, let's begin by being together in each other's presence for this and see where it goes.
If I could add, I've seen it at the Eucharist. I normally would be celebrating the Eucharist in Fitzroy, and towards the end of my ministry, I always invited Gerry. I would sit at a table. The elders, say 10, 12 elders who are part of the leadership of the church, would be men and women, would be beside me, and the leader of the elders would be sitting, he would be on my right, and I asked my elders, could Gerry come and sit at the table with me on my left? Because there was always a spare seat. There's the place where I would sit, and then what they call the clerk of the session, and then there's a spare seat, and then the other elders would be around. And my elders, this is the impact of one person's life, is what I want to just say to you, the empowering of a pioneer. The impact of one person without any pressure, just befriending and in the process defrosting the environment around him towards the end of my ministry, the last 10 years, I was able to invite Gerry to sit at the Eucharist beside me, right beside me, when we were breaking bread and giving the wine. He found that, for me, that was really signaling there's no division in God's family. But Gerry was still rooted and faithful to his own tradition, and he would sometimes just look at the bread and the wine, everybody else being fed, and he would feel an outsider, emotionally. He felt he couldn't. It wasn't from us not inviting him, from himself. And I felt in the same way when I was at Clonard. I would sometimes want to go forward, and I have often gone forward to receive the Eucharist in different places where the priest doesn't know me and doesn't cause him any problems. And Val and I would go forward. Sometimes we would cross our hands like this. And we did this once in Rome. And we thought, well, you know, this is what you do. And the priest, who didn't know what this meant, he put it straight into my mouth. Right. And I said, Amen. And I went and sat down. And then I said, I'll leave the canon lawyers to work it out. But what I felt often was that when you can't celebrate the Lord's Supper, it's his meal. When you can't celebrate it together, and when there's a kind of, as I would say to Gerry, a kind of spiritual apartheid. Gerry used to face this by asking the question, from being at different Eucharistic celebrations in Protestant churches, does our one Heavenly Father give different food to Protestants than he does to the Catholic children? And he didn't hammer it, he just asked the question, and I have never heard a response to that. It's such a wonderful thing. If you have the same Heavenly Father, what does that make us? We're brothers and sisters. Can you imagine a parent saying, well, you know, for you, look at what I've got out for you. And there's a table over there for other persons in the family. I used to feel sometimes when I couldn't participate in the Eucharist, I used to feel like a child at Christmas, looking through a window at a happy family, Christmas tree up and all the presents under the tree and everybody running around having a great time. And I felt I was outside in the cold looking in. Now, Gerry had the same kind of feeling as an insider. He came away from the tree and he looked out through the same window at me looking in, and he was saying, you should be in here. You should be in here. And that was the source of his pain. So at the Eucharist, sometimes Gerry broke down in tears. And what he was really saying through all of that is, and this is what I would like to look at now, that the church has to be 20 years ahead of the rest of the community. The church has to set an agenda. If we have only one Heavenly Father and we are really brothers and sisters, and if we believe in being united as Christians, what are the political implications of unity in Ireland? What are the political implications of that? Being a bringer together, as God is. If your faith says Jesus Christ is a good shepherd, and I have sheep and other folds that are not part of this flock yet, but I've got to bring them too. If you're a bringer together by instinct because of your connection with God, and that's working through you for 70 years, and your whole instinct is to bring people together, what are the political implications for that? One of the key things is no coercion. No coercion. The door's left open for you to enter in. And so there are political implications about how we go forward and reshape a community and reshape families so there's more togetherness there. Bringing families together, it's a very deep instinct, isn't it? And what pain's caused when not everybody comes along. Bringing a community together, bringing a country together, what are the implications of this politically? That's a massive, massive question. But what I have learned from Father Gerry is there should be no coercion on anybody. And secondly, it should be something you're attracted into. and the door should be open. To have an open heart, an open political system that says to other people, you're as welcome here as I am, and I want you to be part of that. What does that say for the future of every part of Ireland, including this part? That, I suppose, I'm suggesting here is that Father Gerry's life and his work and his faith, which is my faith, that has very big political implications for the future of the country. And the church should murder, by the way it acts, as gathering everybody together. It should act as saying, we can do this together. We don't need other people to fly in and tell us how to be a family. We don't need other political leaders to shout at us and tell us we have to do this, we have to do that. We can do it ourselves. We are a family, and we have got to show that. And there are huge political implications for that. And Father Gerry showed me something very important. The way into uniting peoples through friendship. Totally open friendship, totally respectful friendship, totally equal friendship. And it's not something where you can say, you've got to do it my way or no way. So that to me is part of the political as well as cultural and religious legacy of Father Gerry's life, and why his life in my eyes is a very, very important life. He lived it, and I think it's within our possibilities to live in the same way and also to have the same good defrosting influence through both our faith and our friendship and our values wherever we live.
Can I just ask, how important would it have been, you mentioned Father Gerry defrosting, just by his presence, Father Gerry's personality, his deep spiritual presence, really, when you be speaking to him, always come across as very calm, very spiritual person. How important was that when we were talking to people who would not have been the violence, people involved with violence, to help bring that down, even before he would even say anything? What do you think was his presence that would have helped that situation?
Well, I think you picked up something very, very characteristic of Father Gerry, and that is his lovely presence with you. He had a terrific ability to concentrate on you. He wouldn't be looking over your shoulder thinking, I have to go now, or all those other things that signal to the person, I have other things to do apart from listen to you. He really zoomed in on you and gave you his time and attention. And I saw that in his befriending of loyalist paramilitaries, because on one occasion I felt comfortable with Republicans, but I didn't feel comfortable with loyalists, because loyalists would often interpret my friendship with Republicans as me being a crypto-Republican. And in the same way, when Father Gerry went among the loyalists, there's no doubt that people like Gusty Spence and David Irvine, and Val and I, with Father Gerry, attended David Irvine's funeral. I spoke at his funeral, gave a tribute. I was one of 18 who spoke. And we all walked up a Newtownards Road together behind his hearse, and there was Father Gerry and other people from the north, south, east and west walking up the Newtownards Road. But what you're saying is really important, because I was asked to go to meet the Combined Loyalist Military Command with Father Gerry and Alec Reid. And I really didn't want to go because I didn't feel comfortable. But when I walked into the room, immediately the 20 of them who were there, brigadiers and leaders of the UVF, UDA, probably Red Hand, I don't know, they immediately went towards Alec and towards Gerry. And Gerry's and Alec's approach to them was really, it had been developed over a couple of years before that. They had reached a point where they could crack jokes. And the person who was chairing the meeting, I think it was Gusty Spence, he had behind him a picture of Northern Ireland, the 6 counties. And this was my first, I was sitting over here saying nothing for the first half hour. I was a bit like that. In fact, I looked under the car when I arrived to check, or at least when I was going to check, there were nothing under my car. But to cut a long story short, let me just say this, that Alec and Gerry teased them. I thought, dear Lord, it's like talking like Daniel Land's den talking to the lions, you know, just before they eat him up. And they said to him, he said, would you answer us a question? And this was Alec and Gerry talking. He said, that map of Ireland that you have behind your head there, what has happened to the other 26 counties? Have they drifted off into the middle of the Atlantic somewhere? You know, it's just the 6 counties. And all the guys were, never noticed, you know, never noticed. I was going like that. But the friendship was very, very real. And I was delighted to see folk from the Loyalist community, some of the Loyalist paramilitaries. I was glad to see some of their representatives at Gerry's funeral. And they also accepted an invitation. David Irvine accepted an invitation to speak at Clonard with Alec Maskey shortly after Alec was made Lord Mayor. And they spoke in Clonard Hall. And I think there was maybe 100, 150, 200 people there to hear them speak. And that was the drawing power of Gerry's and Alec's friendship. They could ask anybody to come to Clonard and they would come because they trusted them. And Gerry's warmth as a person. I used to say that Alec was an electrician. He got, the lights weren't on in the stadium, and he went behind the scenes and got the two sides together, wrapped himself around like sellotape around them and got the lights on again. Lights come on. What Gerry did was he installed central heating. Right? So you met Gerry for a couple of years, no matter what was going through your system, put your hand on your heart after 2 or 3 years meeting Gerry, and you'll feel the beginning of the water coming through and heating up the radiator. That's what I noticed about Gerry. But that ability to really concentrate and care for and value people was a warmth that was reciprocated from sometimes the most unexpected places, but it was very, very real.
And there are even cases in the diaries where he recorded people with Loyalist connections coming to him for like spiritual guidance and prayer. You know, so it doesn't get any more intimate than that, really, I suppose. Yeah.
I'm a member of the Methodist Church, and I'm a supporter of the Enjoyable Hope initiative, which was begun by the Reverend Dennis Cook, who was the president of Edgehill, who has a very close relationship with Father Gerry. I know. I had the privilege of being blessed by him at the Joint Eucharistic services, which was absolutely lovely and a real privilege. But the Enjoyable Hope initiative is not taking place.
Oh, is it not?
And I feel that it would be a great tribute and a great memory to Father Gerry if that could be reignited. Yeah. And I'm sure there is a will there somewhere, but I think it would be a great tribute to him if people could look at that as a view to beginning it once again.
Yeah, how long's it stopped? I thought it was still going. No? Oh well, there's an error in the book that didn't get corrected. But no, but thanks for sharing that, yes.
Could I say just one final thought about Father Gerry? And it's a challenge to us all. It's this whole idea of living an inclusive lifestyle. Don't hang around with people that are all like yourself. Look at yourself for a moment and say, I want my circle of friends to be much more inclusive. That's a big, big step. Because what you do when you do that, and this is important for the church and for politics, culture, embody the future. Gerry Reynolds embodied the future of the church. The church has to get rid of the divisions between Christians, and it has to work together for something better. And secondly, that we have also to embody the future politically. That if Gerry can accommodate me as a Presbyterian, there's no reason why we cannot accommodate each other politically. Not one reason on earth. That if we can be linked together for so long, 32 years, and many of us are like that, many of us have those friendships, we are embody the future by the choice of your friendships and then push for that future. That's what Father Gerry did. And I think that is what really strikes me about the future. I'm very hopeful because I think more and more people are making that choice. I'm going to live inclusively and I'm going to embody a different future from the horrific past that has marked this country.
And I mean, it's really, Gerry was very visionary, and you know, what Ken's saying there and what you were saying earlier about, you know, what this means, implications for the future of Ireland as a whole going forward and stuff. That sounds maybe really scary and only visionaries can do it and so forth. But actually another thing I think that you can learn from Gerry was he was always looking for just the next right step to take. So even if the vision is big and seems unattainable, it's that next small step, and that was what he was good at doing, really, in some ways, even though his vision was big and at times may have drove people crazy because it seems so big and unattainable, just looking for that next small thing to do to live more inclusively. I mean, that's the key to it, really.